Welcome back. Let's take a look at these two images again. You'll remember that to create these two versions of the image, the camera let in either more or less light. In order to do this, the camera has to have a way of regulating how much light comes into the camera. It turns out your camera doesn't have just one, but rather two ways of regulating the amount of light coming into the camera. These two ways are aperture and shutter speed. When you're learning how your camera works, this can be particularly maddening. It would be simple if your camera had one function that let in more or less light, but it doesn't. It has two, which makes learning how your camera works much more complicated. On the flip side, once you've learned how it works, the payoff is really wonderful. The upside of having both aperture and shutter speed at your disposal is that you end up with a lot of control over how your images visually look. I have a great way of explaining both these concepts and how they work together. By the end of this class, you'll really get the whole world of it. I want to acknowledge that what we did in the last section, exposure compensation, is very much related to aperture and shutter speed. I'm not going to explain that connection to you until closer to the end of this class. What I'll ask you to do is set aside what we learned in the last section, and we'll come back to that later. Let's start with the nuts and bolts of what's happening with aperture and shutter speed. The aperture is located inside your lens. The aperture acts like the pupil in your eye. The opening gets bigger and smaller based on the aperture that your camera chooses or you choose. Because your aperture is located in your lens, when you change the lens on your camera, you may actually change the range of apertures that are available to you. Your shutter is located in the body of your camera and controls the shutter speed. This isn't exactly how it works, but your shutter acts like a shower curtain that opens and closes for the amount of time that either your camera chooses or you choose. So you can see how shutter speed works. I want you to change into S or TV mode, whichever one you happen to have on your camera. Consult your manual on how to change your shutter speed and change it to 2 seconds. It will most likely appear as the number 2 with hatch marks. Panasonic Lumix cameras will not have the hatch marks and will just display the number 2. Give or take, you have about 54 choices for shutter speed, so some of you will have a lot of spinning of the dial to do before you see 2 seconds. The shutter speed should not be any of the following. Now what you're about to do is not a visual exercise. Instead, I'm going to have you do a listening exercise. I'm going to have you take a picture, but it doesn't matter what you take a picture of. The picture probably won't come out anyway. Put your camera next to your ear, take a picture, and listen to the 2 sounds your camera makes. Did you notice the 2 sounds were exactly 2 seconds apart? Those 2 sounds were the sounds of your shutter opening and closing. Now, up until this point, you've probably associated the sound of your camera taking a picture with the sound of one click. It's never one click, though. You think it's one click because your camera is usually shooting at shutter speeds of 1/60th of a second, 1/250th of a second, or maybe even 1/1000th of a second. When your camera fires at such fast shutter speeds, there's still an open and close click, but they happen so quickly, open, close, your brain only hears one click. What I just had you do was separate out the open and the close so you can really understand that every time you take a picture, your camera lets in light for an exact amount of time. Some of you watching this class will have cameras that shoot as fast as 1/8000th of a second. When a camera fires at a shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second, that camera allows light to hit the digital sensor for exactly 1/8000th of a second, not 1/7000th of a second and not 1/9000th of a second. Now I want you to go back to P mode. We'll be going over all the modes a little later in the class. Before we do anything else, I want you to set your exposure compensation, the setting we were playing with in the last segment, back to 0. We're done playing with that for now, so we're going to put it back to the default setting. We'll come back to it a little later in the class, but for now, I want you to have that setting on 0. Now I want you to see where your aperture is. I don't mean that I want you to see how to change your aperture, since we'll get to that later. For now, I just want you to see where your camera displays the aperture. To see your aperture and shutter speed, you may need to press your shutter button down halfway. On some cameras, no matter which display you're looking at, the back, the viewfinder, or the top display, the aperture number is displayed with an F before it and is displayed next to the shutter speed. On others, you won't see the F displayed. Once you've found the aperture, I want you to point your camera at something on the darker side. By darker, I mean something that isn't being lit up by a lot of light. You might notice as you move the camera around the room that the aperture and shutter speed numbers are changing. We'll talk about that in a moment. For now, as I mentioned, point your camera at something on the darker side. Get close to that object and zoom in so that it's really taking up most of your frame. I want you to take note of what aperture and shutter speed your camera is suggesting you use. Once you have that in mind, point your camera at something on the brighter side. If you're indoors, you can point your camera at a lamp or ceiling light. If you're near a window during the day, point your camera out the window. You should notice that you'll get a different combination of numbers for your aperture and shutter speed. One or both numbers will change. Why is that? The reason is that there is a different amount of light coming from the darker scene than there is from the brighter scene. Your camera needs to choose a different combination of aperture and shutter speed to compensate for that amount of light so that it captures an image that is properly exposed. Whenever you point your camera at any scene, your camera knows exactly what you can see through your viewfinder. That scene has a definable top, bottom, left, and right, and your camera measures the amount of light coming from that specific scene. Light is measurable. Your camera measures the light and applies a number to that amount of light. You'll never see that number since your camera doesn't show it to you. It's embedded in the software of your camera. Here's a super geeky fact for you that I find completely fascinating. That number is actually the number of candles it would take to replicate the amount of light in the scene where you're pointing your camera. You're out camping in the middle of nowhere. It's nighttime and there's a full moon. The amount of light you're working with is roughly equal to 1 candle's worth of light. Let's say you're in your living room with all the lights turned on. That's roughly equal to 80 candles worth of light. If you're in a bright office, that's roughly equal to 320 candles worth of light. Now get this. If you're pointing your camera at an object or scene that is lit directly by sunlight, that amount of light is roughly equal to as much as 130,000 candles worth of light. This is a huge range of lighting conditions, and the way your camera has to deal with such a huge range is aperture and shutter speed. The next thing I'm going to explain to you is the hardest thing to understand in this class. I always mention that in this part of the class because if I don't, some of you will zone out, and what I'm about to explain is really important. The other reason I mention that is because a lot of beginner photographers get stuck on the concept I'm about to explain to you. In fact, I got stuck on this concept for an entire year. I have a really great way of explaining it, so I know you'll get it, but it'll really take you listening intentionally. What I'm about to explain to you is how aperture and shutter speed work together. Imagine you have a barrel. You want to fill that barrel with a set amount of water. You have an exact amount of water in mind, maybe 3/4 full, maybe all the way full. Whatever that is for you. You have an exact amount of water in mind. The reason I'm using this analogy is that every time you take a picture, you're filling your camera with a set amount of light. When I took this picture, I wanted the exact amount of light that would give me white snow. I didn't want less light. I didn't want more light. I wanted exactly the amount of light that would give me white snow. So let's go back to the barrel analogy. You've got this barrel and you know how much water you want in the barrel. Imagine you have 2 options on how you fill the barrel. You can use a garden hose or a fire hose. Does it make sense to you if I say, if you use the fire hose to fill the barrel, it will take you less time? I'll say that again. You have 2 options to fill the barrel with water, a garden hose and a fire hose. If you use the fire hose, it'll take you less time to fill the barrel. That is how aperture and shutter speed work. To get the exact amount of light that will give me white snow, there wasn't just one combination of aperture and shutter speed that would work to let in that exact amount of light. I had options. I could have either used a smaller aperture for more time, in other words, a longer shutter speed, or I could have used a larger aperture for less time, in other words, a faster shutter speed. Both of those would give me the same amount of light and give me white snow. And I don't just have two options. I can also do a medium-sized aperture for a medium amount of time. Typically, a camera will offer you about 16 to 18 options as far as which aperture and shutter speed combination will give you what the camera thinks is a proper exposure. Now, I fully realize that at this point, you have no idea how to practically apply what I've just taught you to your day-to-day photography. That's okay. We'll get into that in the next few segments. At this moment, I simply want you to understand how aperture and shutter speed work together. Just like you have choices for how to fill a barrel, you can use a garden hose for more time or a fire hose for less time. You have choices for how to get a specific amount of light into a camera during a single shot. You can do a smaller aperture for more time or a bigger aperture for less time. Here's another way of thinking about this. Imagine that your goal is to get to the number 10. You can get to 10 by adding 1 and 9, 2 and 8, 3 and 7, 4 and 6, and so on. The first number is aperture, and the second number is shutter speed. To get to 10, you need a combination of both numbers, but there's more than one combination that will get you there. If I want white snow in the image, I can do that with many combinations of shutter speed and aperture, and they will all get me to the same amount of light. Now we're going to dive into the world of how to use aperture and shutter speed.